There is the saying that the good die young. I know Gurdjieff says that we shouldn't listen to these sayings. They are just sayings to help those get over things, understand things that are more complicated in the cosmic laws. But now I'm beginning to wonder if the good die young, because they are incorruptible. Lucifer and Ahriman cannot corrupt these people, and so they are taken out at a young age. And the reason I wonder this is because of what Rudolf Steiner says about how Lucifer and Ahriman, or their minions, there is a Luciferic and an Ahrimanic being in each one of us. And I'm going to read some of Rudolf Steiner's lecture on this and discuss it as I go along. So Rudolf Steiner talks about how this doppelganger comes to live in our bodies, and this comes from a lecture that I'm not sure if it's translated into English yet. I think it's GA 178, though you can find some of these notes or further notes on this in the book by Steiner, well, not a book by Steiner, it's a set of lectures by Steiner about the occult movement in the 19th century. So I'm going to quote now Rudolf Steiner. When the human being enters earthly existence through birth, he has a physical body, not only the possibility to give his own soul its existence, but, I ask you to consider this well, the human being does not know everything about this physical body by any means. For there are all sorts of things going on in the physical body that the human knows nothing about. He only learns gradually and in a rather deficient manner through anatomy and physiology what goes on in this body. If we had to wait with feeding ourselves until we had understood the process of nutrition, we could not even claim that human beings would starve, for it is not even conceivable that one could know something about what the organs do in preparing for the nourishment for the organism. I'm going to end the quote there. So he's saying we don't properly understand how our human body works. Now, we might do through doctors, think we what they tell us, and experts about how our physiology works. Obviously we need food to eat and drink to drink and air to breathe to be able to survive and live. And our organs keep our human body working. But he's now going to start talking about what else is in our human body that is not talked about in the mainstream medical science. Quote, the human being thus arrives into this world with his organism in which he clothes himself without reaching down into this organism with his soul. There is, however, an opportunity shortly before we are born, not long at all before we are born, for another spiritual being, in addition to our soul, to take ownership of our physical body, of the subconscious part of our body. End quote. Now many people ask, where does the soul come from? There's a lot of debate as to when the soul enters a human being. Now he's saying here, Steiner, that it comes just before birth. And at the same time, or around the same time, another being is also trying to, or does enter, another spiritual being enters our body. So our soul comes in, which is what we should be working upon. And this spiritual being that has also joined our body is not here to help us with our soul. In fact, it's here to do the opposite. But I shall carry on quoting Rudolf Steiner. It is just a fact that shortly before we are born, we are permeated by another being, whom in our current terminology we would call an Ahrimanic spiritual being. This being is as much within us as our own soul is within us. Such beings live their lives by using the human being in order to be present within the sphere in which they wish to be. I'm just going to end the quote here. So this is about how these Ahrimanic and Luciferic beings, they cannot live on this world. They have no bodies. So they use our bodies, us humans, to live through, which is why everybody on this planet has a luciferic and an Ahrimanic being inside them. And it's how we work with them as to how much they take control of us. And as we can see from most people in this world, and I myself have struggled a lot with this, of where do these thoughts come from? Where do we get ideas and thoughts that just pop into our heads? And normally that, I believe, is Lucifer coming in through our head. And I'll come on to Ahriman in a little minute. But we don't seem to have control of our thoughts. We think we do. Well, the sleepy people think they do. Us people working ourselves are becoming aware that we don't control our thoughts just occur on us. And this is why the Gurdjieff work and Steiner's lectures are here to help us to take control of ourselves, take our control back, and not be operated by these adversarial forces, as Steiner calls them. So I shall continue. This being is as much within us as our own soul is within us. Such beings live their lives by using the human being in order to be present within the sphere in which they wish to be. Okay, I've read that bit already, but I meant to add that, you know, that sphere they wish to be is this earth, this material world. Quote, they have an extraordinarily high level of intelligence and a very highly developed will, but nothing in the nature of our life of feeling, and I'm just going to quickly add here, Steiner uses the word Gemut, G-E-M-U-T, which we don't really have a word for in English, but in this translation of this lecture they've used the word feeling. Continuing the quote. Not what we, in fact I'll start that sentence again. They have an extraordinarily high level of intelligence and a very highly developed will, but nothing in the nature of a life of feeling, not what we would call a human life of feeling. And so it is indeed the case that we go through our lives with a soul and this doppelganger, who is cleverer, far cleverer than we are. This being is highly intelligent, but possesses a Mephistophelian intelligence, an Ahrimanic intelligence, as well as a very strong will. A will that is much closer to the forces of nature than our human will, which is tempered by our life of feeling. I'm just going to end the quote here. So our emotions are part of our human way, but we also are supposed to be, during this work, working on our will and our thinking. If we think of the Gurdjieff work, we're talking about the three centres: intellect, emotional and bodily. And Steiner says the same kind of thing, of we need to be aware of our three ways of being. Thinking, feeling and willing is what Steiner says. So this Ahrimanic being does not have a very strong feeling or emotional side, but he has a much stronger will than us, which is why many people say the devil made me do it, because the devil takes them over. And it also has he is a highly intelligent being, and as he says here, possesses a Mephistophelian intelligence. And those of you that have read your Faust by Goethe will know what I mean by Mephistophelian intelligence. Mephistopheles was the demonic being that gave Faust all his wishes. In return, Faust would have to give up his soul at the end of his life. And these Mephistophelian type beings, they know how to work their way around us. They make deals with us to help us live on this earth, which normally is for people. They forget that this earth, living on this earth, is just one life. Our souls are eternal, and it's our souls they are after. To them, our lives are just a fleeting, glimpse of what's going on in this world, because they live eternally, these beings, or a lot longer than us humans do. So to them, living in our bodies for that little while, 60 to 70 years for most people, that's like a minute to them, I suppose. And we'll go on a bit in a moment about what Steiner says of why they are trying to make us live longer. which of course would make sense of if they have to live in our bodies until we die, which we'll come up to in a moment. They say that these beings cannot cross the threshold into the next realm with us, so when we die they have to leave our bodies and go and find a new place to live, another body to take over. Anyway, I'm going to carry on reading Steiner, and I shall continue with that thought in a moment. In the 19th century, natural science discovered that the nervous system is permeated by electrical forces, and natural science was right about that. However, if science holds, or scientists believe, that our nerve forces, which belong to us and provide a basis for our life of thought, have anything to do with electrical currents passing through our nerves, then they are mistaken. For the electrical currents are the forces placed into our being by that other being whom I have just described, and do not belong to our being at all. We do also carry electrical currents within us, but they are of a purely aromatic nature. End quote. So Steiner is saying our nerve forces, our nervous system is part of our human body, but the electrical current that flows through them is not. That's where the Araman being is. They are of a, as Steiner says, purely aromatic nature, this electrical current that flows through us. And, you know, I've done quite a few shows about how I'm concerned about how the aromatic forces flow through the electrical currents. They flow through electricity. And if they've managed to create an electrical current that then connects with our nervous system, that's what they're living in. And I've often discuss this with people. We don't really know what electricity is. Okay, we can create it through our machines and our conductors and conducers and such like, but we don't actually know what that force is. And from what I'm reading more and more, it seems like it's something from the adversarial side. It's their way of travelling, living inside electrical currents. Anyway, I'm going to carry on reading Steiner. These beings of high intelligence, but of purely Mephistophelian intelligence, and who possess a will that is closer to nature than what can be said of the human will, decided at a certain point, out of their own volition, that they did not want to live in the world to which they had been assigned by the wisdom-filled gods of the upper hierarchy. They wanted to conquer the earth, for which purpose they require bodies, as they do not have bodies of their own. They therefore use as much of the human body as they can, as the human soul is not able to fill the human body completely. End quote. And most of my shows, for those of you that watch regularly, know that I'm talking about developing your soul. We need to be able to fill our human body completely with our human soul. As Gurdjieff says, everybody starts with a germ of a soul, but it's whether they develop it as to what they become, or whether they just ignore it. And if they ignore it and their soul doesn't grow, then them aromatic forces have much more control of you or the person than their own soul does, because they're not filling out their body with their soul, and that soul should be then how should I put it? I was going to say suffocates the aromatic being, but I believe it's still inside us. But I'm sure many of you have, through your own studies, read about, you know, the monks in the deserts of the olden days, in the like the early Christian era. The monks would go out to the desert and live in a cave, and they'd be fighting their devils and demons. And I think that's them having to fight the aromatic being within inside their body and develop their soul so that they can conquer it. And this is what we should be doing. And as Steiner was saying earlier in that paragraph, they wanted to conquer the earth, and they still do, these adversarial forces, and they need bodies to live in to conquer this earth. And if they can take over the bodies and take over the souls and the person, like control the person themselves, then they're more or less living on this earth freely. And we see many people out there, as Madame Helena Blavatsky once said, there are many soulless people walking this planet. If they don't develop their souls, then adversarial forces take people over. Quote, because of the way the human body develops, these beings are thus able to enter into the human body in a certain way at a particular time before the human being is born, and then accompany us below the threshold of our consciousness. End quote. So these Ahrimanic Luciferic beings, they don't really reveal themselves to us. They give us the feeling that it's ourselves talking to us. You know, they're quite clever deceivers. You know, we all have these strange voices in our heads sometimes, or suddenly we think, where does that thought come from? Or you think something, or something's going on in your mind, and you're just like, that's not really how I think. Well, that's probably them trying to turn you. And it's interesting that he says that they accompany us below the threshold of our consciousness. Now, I don't think they're in our subconsciousness. They are hovering in our consciousness, which is how they can quickly interact with us or make us do things. And maybe this is why Gurdjieff says we must work on our subconsciousness, because our subconsciousness is not taken over by them. I don't know, that's something I'm still pondering on, and I'd love to hear what anybody has to say about that. Anyway, quote, there is only one thing in human life that they absolutely cannot endure. They cannot endure death. They must therefore always leave the human body in which they establish themselves before it succumbs to death. Time and again this is a very bitter disappointment for them, as what they seek to appropriate for themselves is precisely the ability to remain in human bodies after death. That would constitute a great accomplishment in the realm of these beings, an accomplishment that they have not achieved as yet. End quote. So coming back to how long do people live? Human beings averaging 60, 70, maybe 80 years in this day and age. We're having all kinds of people possibly being affected or possessed by their Ahrimanic beings who are trying to prolong human life. And I find it quite interesting that in hospitals, you know, we are quite... and let me put it this way, if a dog was suffering, most vets put it down. In hospitals we don't put the humans down. We keep men and women living sometimes very awful lives, you know, when we just feel like it would be better off if we were dead. And you know, I know that's a, you know, part of the doctor's creed. They must try and prolong life for as long as possible. But I wonder if this is coming from an Ahrimanic, Luciferic way of thinking, rather than being humane and putting people out of their misery. But then that would mean this Ahrimanic being would need to find another body. So they're trying their best to prolong life in whatever state our human body is in. So, I'm going to continue quoting. If the mystery of Golgotha had not occurred, and if the Christ had not gone through the mystery of Golgotha, it would long since have been the case on earth that these beings would have seized the opportunity to remain within the human being at the time when the death of the human being is karmically predetermined. Then they would have secured a complete victory over human evolution on earth, and would have become the masters of human evolution on earth. End quote. And with what's been going on in the last, I don't know, maybe 100 years, we do feel that there's a trend going towards transhumanism, which would keep the human body alive longer. And I used to be against all that because I thought we should all be dying naturally when God calls us. But now I'm beginning to see this is all part of the Ahrimanic Luciferic way of keeping the Ahrimanic being entity, this doppelganger, as Steiner says, in the body, and help them to continue to live on this planet, and also perhaps become masters of human evolution. Quote, it is of tremendously deep significance that we appreciate these connections between the Christ passing through the mystery of Golgotha and those beings who wish to conquer death in human nature, but who at present are unable to endure that death. These beings must always be on their guard so that they avoid experiencing within the human body the hour of death predetermined by the human being, avoid maintaining his body after the hour of death, and extending the life of his body beyond the hour of death. End quote. So again, what I was just saying about they're trying to make us live longer, they're trying to find a way to be able to stay in the body for as long as possible. You know, if we do somehow have a medical breakthrough that can make, well, conquers death, then them Aramanic luciferic beings will be inside every human for us, unless they work on themselves and develop their souls and get them out, will be taking over humanity. Steiner does go on to talk about then the occult science of all this, which can be read further in this lecture, which I would recommend people went and read, because he does go on later on to remind everybody that one lacks an adequate grasp of things to understand this life in retrospect if one is unable to shed light on a being that plays such a large part in our life as this Aramanic being, a being who sees his ownership of us before our birth, and who is always there and will always prefigure us in our subconsciousness if we do not continuously shed light on this. For wisdom becomes light after death. And wisdom also develops the soul, but to do that we need to work on ourselves, find knowledge that we can then turn into wisdom. Understanding obviously helps with the knowledge to that develop into wisdom. But going back to those that are working on themselves, we need to be doing this so that we can develop our three centres, our intellect, our emotional and our physical body, and take control of them, and not let this Aramanic being, this doppelganger, have control of us. Steiner goes on to say, these beings are generally very important for human life, and knowledge of them must gradually be grasped by human beings, and will be grasped by human beings. Only knowledge of them must be grasped by people in the right way. It must not just be spread within humanity by occult brotherhoods who turn it into a question of power, intending thereby to increase their own power. Above all, it must not be kept secret any longer for the purpose of increasing the power of certain brotherhoods acting out of egotism. And Steiner talks a lot about these occult brotherhoods and how they steal power from people. But they're interesting lectures as well. I think I've got some of them up as the occult. What was it? The Occult in the 19th Century by Rudolf Steiner. Anyway, continuing. Humanity is striving for universal knowledge, and such knowledge must be allowed to spread. It can no longer be beneficial in future for occult brotherhoods to use such things in order to increase their own power. Knowledge of these beings, this is the Aramanic beings, the doppelganger, knowledge of these beings must increasingly be grasped by human beings over the next few centuries. Human beings will have to become increasingly aware over the next few centuries that they bear within themselves such a doppelganger, such an Aramanic Mephistophelian doppelganger. Human beings need to know this. Today, people have already acquired quite a number of concepts, but these are in fact blind concepts, as people do not yet really know what to make of them. I am saying that people are developing concepts today that can only be given a sound basis if they are brought together with the facts that underlie them. End quote. And these facts that underlie them obviously is his spiritual science that he's been talking to people about and trying to teach people. But now he's going to talk about illness and what causes illness. Quote, this doppelganger of whom I have spoken is nothing more or less than the originator of all physical illnesses that arise spontaneously from within us, and knowing him fully is organic medicine. Illnesses that arise spontaneously in the human being, not through external injuries, but spontaneously from within, do not originate in the human soul, but derive from this being. He is the originator of all illnesses that emerge spontaneously from within. He is the originator of all organic illnesses. And a brother of his, who is not Aramanic but luciferic in nature, is the originator of all neuroasthenic and neurotic illnesses. All illnesses that are in fact not illnesses, but just, as they are described, nervous disorders, hysterical disorders, and so on. Medical science must therefore become spiritual in two directions. I'm going to end the quote there. So he's talking about becoming spiritual in the two directions of seeing why these two two different styles of illnesses come from. So we've got, the luciferic is coming from the nervous system, nervous disorders, and working on, neurotic disease illnesses, whereas the Aramanic is bringing out diseases from within the body that are probably more like cancers and heart diseases and things like that. And once medical science starts realising what this is, which is why I was saying about sometimes the good die young, because maybe they've realised they don't want to stay in a person's body that cannot be corrupted. If a good person can really work on their soul, and it is a really tough struggle, the dark forces will probably find a way to take them out. But I'm not saying this to discourage you from doing your own work. There are monks, as I was saying earlier, that have lived for a long time after their battle with their demons within them. So we can conquer them, but they will still be within us, but we must have control of our soul. Or as Ari Forrison says, and I've been putting his books up lately, and I will be recording more of his books, we invite the Christ in, because the Christ is the one that can. Well, he doesn't defeat Ahriman and Lucifer, he Christianizes them. He redeems them, as I've been saying in the shows I do about Archangel Michael. Michael redeems the devil. Michael doesn't slay the devil, he redeems him, and this is what we are here to help do with our own Ahrimanic and Luciferic being within us. Steiner goes on to talk about the geographical implications of where people are living and why certain Ahrimanic beings and Luciferic beings work in certain ways and certain geological places or geographical places. But I'm just going to skip ahead a bit and read a bit more from the same lecture. Quote, all of this only really becomes immensely significant in the 5th post-Atlantean period now, and will become especially important for humanity in the very near future. That is also why knowledge of spiritual science must be spread now. It is especially important now because the present time calls for human beings to come to terms and engage deliberately with these things in a conscious manner. Human beings must become strong in our epoch so that they can order their existence with these beings. End quote. So this is what I'm talking about, of working on ourselves. We're taking control of ourselves. We're taking back our soul. I've been doing these quotes since 2020 of don't be controlled. Stay awake, save your soul. Or was it stay awake, don't be controlled, save your soul? And these are the things that we should be doing with ourselves, not just in the material, secular world, but also in our spiritual workings. These doppelgangers want to take us out. We need to not let them have control of us. We must not let them manipulate us, and we must not let them have our soul. And we definitely must not let them send us back to sleep, which is what they do try to do, send everyone back to sleep. I'm just going to end with another quote from Steiner in the same lecture. Spiritual science alone will enable real historical understanding. But as you can see, prejudice upon prejudice will naturally arise against it. I'm just going to end the quote here. There's going to be so many people that are against this because we're living in a very rational world at the moment, or rational thinking world, which is again something I think Lucifer and Ahriman brought in. They took away the spirituality because they don't want people looking at their spirituality. They want people thinking they're living a sane life by thinking rationally, and at some point they're going to try and make out that any kinds of thoughts like these are all people with probably mental health issues, and that spirituality might become a mental disease to them. But that's because they're not looking with their spiritual eyes. But let's hope that doesn't happen. We must send out them thought forms and develop ourselves so that kind of thing does not happen. Continuing. But as you can see, prejudice upon prejudice will naturally arise against it. For how could one think otherwise than that knowledge will also become partisan? That is one of the reasons, which are actually reasons of cowardice, why certain occult brotherhoods have held these things back. They held back for the simple reason that these insights are frequently uncomfortable for people who do not want to become universally human. This applies especially to those who have the inclination to unite themselves with what streams out geographically, end quote. We can also say with what streams out of us from the Aramanic Luciferic doppelgangers within us that people think are themselves, think they are their own faults, their own beings inside them, when really they are adversarial forces. So I wanted to do this lecture because I had quite a few people listening to the Steiner lectures I've been putting up lately and looking at the different shows I've been doing on the Aramanic Luciferic beings, and so I thought I'd just dip a bit deeper into that lecture. Another book I highly recommend is The Electrical Doppelganger, which has various lectures by Steiner about this very, I was going to say problem, this very situation. It's edited by Andreas Nieder. I think there's a German version and an English version, but he's got what I think are the relative parts of these lectures of how we can become aware of this Luciferic Aramanic doppelganger within us and work towards redeeming it and saving our soul. So stay awake, people. Don't be controlled. Save your soul.